So, picking up with part two of our lecture on the ancient civilizations, part two, corresponding to the second chapter in the textbook. And here we're going to be focusing primarily on the Assyrians and the Persians, both of whom we've encountered prior, albeit in connection with another people, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. So the kingdom of Israel, as we discussed, fell to the Assyrians at some point, and then the kingdom of Judah to the Neo-Babylonians, but then coming under Persian rule. So let's start with the Assyrians, right? A Semitic-speaking people based in the northern part of Mesopotamia, who, for a while were under the rule of other empires, but then finally became independent around 1360 BCE, and then emerged as a regional power under the ruler Tiglath-Pileser, who reigned between 1114 to 1076 BCE. And by 700 BCE, the Assyrians had conquered almost the entire Near East, inclusive of Egypt. So the biggest empire to date that we've encountered. And, we might look at the map here where we can see how extensive the Assyrian Empire was, again, including Egypt. You might recall that Egypt had started to go into decline a few centuries prior, having come under attack from the Libyans, also a mysterious group of people known as the Sea Peoples. We're not quite sure who they were. But then eventually losing any independence altogether and becoming part of this much more extensive empire, the Assyrian Empire. Probably the high point for the empire would be under Ashurbanipal, who reigned between 669 and 626 BCE. So a very capable, very powerful ruler, but also confronted with numerous problems, many of which related to the fact that the empire had simply become so large. It was overextended. And when you have a very large amount of territory under your control, it can become a bit difficult to govern, particularly if many of your subject peoples are not particularly happy to be under your rule, as was the case with the Assyrians. And we're going to find out why. So again, Ashurbanipal, very capable, but having to suppress rebellions left and right. And you get into this situation where while you're repressing a rebellion in one part of the empire, this becomes an opportunity for people in another part of the empire to rise up. In addition to that, you had very ambitious regional governors during this period that were often waging military campaigns against one another. And so again, Ashurbanipal, very capable, but unfortunately following his death, the empire would very quickly disintegrate, coming to an end in 605 BCE. So again, proving he was a very capable ruler, able to manage the various problems confronting the empire, but his successors proved not to be quite up to the challenge. The capital of Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, and then finally the empire coming under the control of a new people, the Chaldeans, with the formation of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and that would happen in 605 BCE. And on the left you see images from the archaeological site of Nineveh, which are in pretty good shape. So that's very helpful as far as knowing quite a bit about them. And what do we know about the Assyrians? Probably most famous for the ruthlessness of their armies, which we're going to explore in greater detail shortly. So they were extremely effective, right? Both in the sense of having really good military leaders, very effective fighters. In some ways, the largest armies we've seen to date. They had a very large population. If you were an Assyrian subject, that was one expectation, that you should serve in the army. So able to deploy large numbers of soldiers when necessary, up to 12,000, and extremely well organized and disciplined armies. Structurally, the core of their army was the infantry, but the cavalry played a very important role. And in fact, as far as popular conceptions of the Assyrians go, when we think of their military, and not to exaggerate how familiar people are with the Assyrians, but if you've seen any images reflective of them, a good chance is you saw horse-drawn war chariots, right? Which, though not the core of their army, really played a very important role in their military successes. They were effectively moving platforms for firing arrows, right? So in terms of the structure of the chariot, very stable. They were also very famous for their ability to fire off arrows very accurately while in motion. And so that was definitely a major factor in their success. Also, the first large armies to use iron weapons, right? So we already encountered the Hittites who used iron, but the armies have become much bigger now. And, also kind of improving on the technology in terms of the kind of weapons they were able to fashion from iron. And even though, we started off by noting they had very large armies, but they were extremely flexible, right? So, I mean, large army, they could, they were very effective with a large army in kind of, conventional warfare involving open ground. But they were very quick to adapt to, if the circumstances required it or the terrain was not suitable for open warfare, they could fight guerrilla style warfare, right? So very flexible, very adaptable in that regard. And they were really good at laying siege, right? And that's often, kind of the culmination of a campaign when you finally surround a city. But very often cities would have very formidable defensive walls. They would be preparing for an attack by storing food and water. The idea that they could hold out for a long period of time. So the shorter the siege, right, the more likely you would be able to take the city. And so they developed some really effective technology for kind of ensuring a successful siege, right? They had these siege towers with armored battering rams. They developed some very effective tactics, such as constructing tunnels under the defensive walls to undermine their foundations. And of course, probably most important would be cutting off a population's supplies so that eventually they would be compelled to surrender on threat of starvation. And that more or less brings us full circle back to where we began our discussion of the Assyrian army, where we noted they were most famous for their ruthlessness. And that is because they actually used terror as a tactic, kind of strategically, in fighting opponents or in repressing rebellious subject people, right? So, terror in this case, not just kind of a side effect of military campaigns, unintended, but just something that happens as a consequence of war, but actually something planned as a way of, either compelling the next target to surrender, once word got around about what happened to another people in a previous campaign, or at the very least, effectively demoralizing the opponents so that they were unable to provide effective resistance. So the Assyrians would completely annihilate countries they were fighting, right? In the sense of destroying entirely their economic basis, right? So that aside from the number of people killed, very difficult to recover, right? You'd really be suffering for decades after this, right? They'd wreck dams, destroy and loot towns, set fire to crops, and cut down trees. They were, of course, also very ruthless with their captives, mutilating or burning them to death, and then leaving piles of rotting corpses in front of the main gates of conquered cities, right? And all of this, again, word would very quickly spread, and whoever was being subjected to an Assyrian campaign next would probably hear about this and very likely might just simply surrender, right? It would also, of course, act as a warning to subject people in the empire who might be thinking of rebelling. And of course, they would deploy these same tactics when dealing with rebellious subject peoples. So what was it like living in the Assyrian Empire? We might start with the Assyrian government, a strong monarchical system of government with, king at the top, absolute power, very well developed bureaucracy, right? People working in government who would carry out the king's decrees. The Assyrians also developed a very efficient system of communication, which as empires become bigger becomes imperative, right? The ability to get information from the far-flung corners of the empire very quickly and then to relay orders to those points very quickly as well, right? So what they had was a system of communication involving posting stages with relays of horses to carry messages throughout the empire, very much like the Pony Express used in the United States during the kind of early period of expanding westward. And some of you might be familiar with that, right? So someone would ride on horseback very quickly until the horse became exhausted, but then kind of like passing on the baton, passing on the message or information to the next rider with a fresh horse who would then do the same thing until, finally the message or information that was required would arrive at its destination. And in fact, this system was very efficient, so efficient that a provincial governor anywhere in the empire could send a question to the king and get a response within a week. And that might sound like a long time, but back in the day before kind of electronic means of communication, that would have been pretty good. Well, Assyrian society, with all these subject people in the empire, and given their practice of very often forcibly relocating conquered populations, particularly if they had been taken prisoner, in other parts of the Assyrian Empire, you really had what we might call a polyglot in terms of ethnicity, right? So society as a whole within the Assyrian Empire, very racially and linguistically mixed, with between 4 to 5 million people being relocated over a period of 3 centuries. Right? We already talked about how that is what happened to the kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes, after that known as the 10 lost tribes, being forcibly relocated throughout the Assyrian Empire and then eventually losing any sense of themselves as a distinct people. Right? But on the other hand, that meant wherever you went in the Assyrian Empire, a tremendous amount of diversity in terms of ethnicity and language. And unlike the Jews, the Assyrians themselves quite happy to mix with other peoples, even if they did maintain a sense of their own distinct identity in connection with their own language and their own religion. And in fact, Assyria literally means the land of Ashur, which is a reference to their chief god. And as with other ancient traditions of royalty, the Assyrian king was understood as the human representative of Ashur, right? So that did, kind of provide the foundation of their sense of themselves as a distinct people. But that tied in quite nicely with their willingness to intermingle with other peoples, various subject peoples that came under their rule, because part of what it meant to be Assyrian from their point of view was that they kind of had a special mission to preserve in a much broader sense Mesopotamian culture, right? Even as pertained to various peoples preceding them. And so, again, they basically, part of being Assyrian meant to assimilate as much of Mesopotamian civilization as possible. And in that sense, they constituted something of a hybrid. They were the guardians of Mesopotamian culture, and saw themselves as kind of carrying on the cultural legacy of preceding peoples, for instance, the Babylonians and even the earlier Sumerians. And a really good example or manifestation of that would be the library created by Ashurbanipal in the capital city of Nineveh, which contained all the available works of Mesopotamian history going right back to the earliest written records. And part of this cultural mission meant also incorporating all of the Mesopotamian gods and goddesses going right back to the beginning, right? So their pantheon included virtually all of them, right? They did have their own god, Ashur, as the chief deity. But that even kind of corresponds to a very ancient Mesopotamian tradition where you would have a patron god or goddess of your own city, but recognize the existence of other gods and goddesses. Assyrian art. They are actually pretty well known for the relief sculptures, particularly those found in the royal palaces of the Assyrian capital cities. Nineveh, the most important, but there were others, 3 in total. They used stone a good deal more than some of the earlier civilizations further south in Mesopotamia, simply because it was more available. And the reliefs usually dealt with military topics, right? Kind of in keeping with their reputation for having a very effective military, usually depicting the king and his warriors. And usually the theme was, if not war, then at least hunting. Economically speaking, the Assyrians were mostly agricultural, so trade was important. And in large measure, this was a consequence of Assyria's central location, such that trade passed through Assyria quite a bit. But they weren't themselves especially active in trade. Very often it would be other subject peoples. But there were many goods being imported: timber, wine, precious metals. And they did produce some goods that would be for export, like textiles that were produced in palaces, temples, and even private homes. And metals such as gold, silver, copper, and bronze were used within the empire as a medium of exchange, right? So that greatly facilitated the interaction between different peoples. That you had kind of a almost something resembling a shared currency. So we mentioned already that the Assyrian Empire came to an end at the hands of the Chaldeans, who captured the Assyrian capital city of Nineveh in 612 BCE, and then went on to establish a new empire centered in Babylon, hence why it's often referred to as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And probably the most famous ruler who we already met, who would defeat the kingdom of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar II, was also the guy who brought the Assyrian Empire to a final end in 605. By the way, some of you might have heard one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. That would correspond to the Neo-Babylonian period. Unfortunately, there's really little left of it, as far as the archaeological record. But by all accounts, it was quite impressive, right? So kind of multi-level structure with gardens hanging off the walls at various levels, and just something incredibly beautiful. So the Chaldean Empire would actually be pretty short-lived, even if it would be pretty extensive. Again, we discussed how at some point they conquer and then incorporate the kingdom of Judah. So we can see here on the map the Chaldean Empire during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. And as you might know from the map, this is concurrent with the emergence of the Persian Empire, which we'll be shortly looking at. So it is short-lived, but it is a prosperous period, in large measure because during this period the city of Babylon will flourish. It becomes a city renowned for its prosperity. A lot of this based on a very strong kind of economy, mostly based on agricultural production, but also textile and metal industries, and of course benefiting from its location smack in the center of Mesopotamia. So that it is very close to a number of very important trade routes. It probably, at this time, would have been considered the greatest city of the ancient world, very famous for its architectural marvels. We already mentioned the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, but also very famous would have been the Ishtar Gate, the city's main entrance, and the adjacent Triumphal Way, or main boulevard of the city. And in this case, though, we do have the remains of the Ishtar Gate. What you see here, most of it from the original structure, but obviously some parts of it reconstructed, it's in pretty good repair. Really worth highlighting also is that this gate, which you see in front of you here, is located not in or near the remains of the ancient city of Babylon, not even in the Near East, but rather in Berlin, in what is known as the Pergamum Museum. So kind of, it's kind of interesting to consider that, because that reflects that during the 19th century, Europe imperialistically dominated most of the world, and they could very often leverage that fact in order to, and probably the most honest way to put it would be to rob other parts of the world of their ancient treasure. In this case, the Ishtar Gate was basically disassembled, crated, shipped to Berlin, and then reassembled and situated now in this museum. By the way, the name Pergamum refers to the ancient Greek city of Pergamum in Anatolia. So if you visit Pergamum in Anatolia today, you will find the most fundamental, foundational remains of structures at the location. But pretty much everything else, most of the buildings there were also disassembled, crated, and then shipped to Berlin, where they were reassembled. So most of the structures from the city of Pergamum, like the Ishtar Gate, to be found in a museum in Berlin. So, if you're there, you should definitely visit it. But in some ways, it speaks as much of the ancient world or as much of European imperialism in the 19th century as it does of the ancient world. In any event, as noted, the Chaldean Empire proves short-lived. It comes to an end shortly after Nebuchadnezzar. The last king is a fellow named Nabonidus, who reigns between 555 539 BCE. Now, perhaps they would have carried on longer if he hadn't essentially angered most of his subject population by neglecting their chief god, Marduk, in favor of, became infatuated with a new god, some moon god named Sin. So what basically happened is during this period, the Persian Empire was rapidly expanding under their ruler Cyrus, and the Babylonians basically opened up the gates to him. They welcomed him as a liberator, and that is how the Neo-Babylonian Empire ended up being absorbed into the Persian one. And with that, we now turn to the Persian Empire, right? So just to start off with, again, to note that modern day Iranians feel that the ancient Persians are very much a part of their own civilizational legacy, their own history, that there is a kind of continuity, civilizationally speaking, running from the ancient Persians all the way up to modern Iranians. And there is actually a lot of historical basis for that. In their origin, the Persians were an Indo-European people, and we've already talked about how that constitutes kind of a linguistic family of languages, but also corresponding to the ethnicities that spoke them. They are actually first mentioned in the Assyrian documents, and it's the first time they're mentioned by anyone, dating back to the 9th century BCE. So that probably does correspond roughly to the period when they began settling there. You might remember the Indo-European people originating in Central Asia. So the Persians were part of this wave of migrations that were headed towards the Mediterranean or India. And in this case, this particular group settling on the Iranian plateau. Somewhere to the south, at that time, there were another people occupying the northern part of the plateau, the Medes, and eventually they would kind of merge into one people. At some point, we simply refer to them collectively as the Persians. And partly that probably reflects that they were very compatible. Both were horse-breeding people. Both were organized into nomadic clans, in both cases led by petty kings, usually assisted by warriors that would come to constitute a class of nobles. And in both cases, the majority of their populations would have included free and unfree peoples. The free people most engaging in agriculture eventually, once they started settling down, or as craftspeople in some cases. And then, of course, in both cases, you had slaves. So the first empire to emerge on the Iranian plateau would actually be under the Medes in the northern part, when they became unified under monarchy around 700 BCE. Shortly after that, the Persians did the same under the Achaemenid dynasty, though eventually they would come under the control of the Medes, would be dominated by them, but that would prove to be short-lived. One ruler we should definitely highlight in connection with this period, with the rise of the Medes, is Cyaxares. In some ways, the founder of the Median Empire, as far as when they really began to matter and when they started to expand the territory under their control. And this is also when they first became prominent, right? When anyone from Iran actually became prominent with respect to developments in the broader region, when the Medes joined the Babylonians in attacking the Assyrians. So in 612 BCE, following the capture of Nineveh, King Cyaxares established the Median Empire, and this really becomes the first Iranian empire in the ancient Near East. But it wouldn't be long before the Persians actually became the dominant element here, and that would happen under Cyrus the Great, who reigned between 559 and 530 BCE. So he was able to unite the Persians in opposition to the Medes, and by 550 BCE had established control over them, at which point their territory, the northern part of the Iranian plateau, became the empire's first province or satrapy, the term they use for province, subject to a Persian governor or satrap. And as we're going to see, as they expand their empire, new territories that are brought under control are kind of maintain their distinct identity as satrapies, right, as kind of distinct provinces of the Persian Empire. And indeed, under Cyrus the Great, the empire will expand very rapidly, both in a western direction, right up to the coastline of Anatolia, which will bring the Persians into conflict with the Greek city-states situated there, which they will defeat and bring under their control, and also in an eastward direction, bringing the rest of the Iranian plateau under Persian control, and then onward towards India. And what's kind of interesting, again, to stress that as new territories are brought under Persian control, and this is almost the antithesis of what the Assyrians did, not only are the people allowed to continue living there, but they are given a certain degree of autonomy administratively, culturally, and religiously. So, for instance, when he captured Babylon in 539 BCE, though converted into a Persian satrapy, he kept many of its government officials in place. And we already talked about, in fact, the Persians had been welcomed there because they seemed prepared to show more respect for the Babylonian gods than their own ruler. In any event, the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great, as is evident from this map, will be quite extensive. And the Persians, again, in part are successful because of their willingness to allow a certain degree of autonomy, not least religiously. And we already encountered that with respect to the Jews. You might remember that when Babylon was conquered, the Jews were permitted to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild their temple. And in fact, that kind of reflects why Cyrus the Great is spoken of quite highly in the Bible itself. Another indication, though, of this practice would be in the many names that the rulers would adopt, right? So, for instance, when Cyrus the Great took over Babylonia, he claimed to be descended from the line of Babylonian kings. And this was, in a way, this might at first glance seem a case of arrogance, but this is really a way of showing respect for the recently conquered people, right? And by doing this, they felt exalted and he was able to win their loyalty. Again, part of the reason he won the support of the Jews is he showed respect for their religion, allowing them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, right? And so very often when they conquered new territories, they would incorporate into their formal title elements that kind of reflected their unique relationship to that territory. So, for instance, the formal title of Cyrus the Great would have been King of all, Great King, Mighty King, King of Babylon, King of the land of Sumer and Akkad, King of the four rims of the earth, the son of Cambyses, the Great King, King of Anshan. And, again, kind of reflecting the idea that he had a distinct relationship with each territory in terms of the legitimacy of his rule. And, this wasn't just Cyrus the Great, but perhaps he embodied these practices more than any other Persian king. He was very famous for being a wise and tolerant ruler, known as Cyrus the Great. The Great, in a sense, kind of referring his manner of government towards subject people. Again, religiously tolerant, not just the Jews. He allowed priesthoods in conquered land to maintain or restore their temples, and conquered people to maintain their religious practices. And again, a certain degree of administrative autonomy. In conquered territories, he would utilize native peoples alongside Persians in their administration. I mean, to be sure, the satrap or governor of the province would have been a Persian, but below that level, in many ways, maintaining or keeping in place what was already there, both structurally and in terms of the actual people doing the administrating. And again, perhaps no better indication of the tolerance exhibited by Cyrus and subsequent rulers of the Persian Empire, but he, again, probably embodied these principles better than anyone, is how he is spoken of in the Bible. One Hebrew prophet regarding Cyrus as the anointed one of God, and this is quoted directly from the Bible. I am the Lord who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd and will accomplish all that I please. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of to subdue nations before him. And consider, Cyrus is a pagan, and he is spoken of as the anointed of God. As it turns out, Cyrus would die in 530 BC, killed in battle. Kind of worth highlighting because, back in those days, the ruler would have been on the front lines. That's not something we're accustomed to based on how wars are fought today. And, for those of you who end up being great admirers of Cyrus, if ever you should find yourself in Iran, you might very well visit his tomb. So the next few rulers are going to prove pretty effective. Persian Empire is going to flourish for some time to come. So you're going to have, very capable rulers, beginning with the son and successor to Cyrus the Great, Cambyses II, who reigns from 530 to 522 BCE. 4 years into his reign, he will successfully invade Egypt and turn it into a Persian satrapy with Memphis as his capital. And not surprisingly, he will take the title of Pharaoh in 525 BCE. Again, understood as a way of showing respect for these newly subjugated people. After him, we have Darius the Great, who emerges as great king following a year of civil war, which he's able to kind of bring to an end. He will reign between 522 and 486 BCE. And so he's going to also continue expanding the empire, but also consolidating Persian control over the territory already gained. So a good example of that will be some of his activities in Egypt, where he codifies Egyptian law, kind of more firmly bringing it into the Persian fold, if you will. Also building a canal linking the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, which enhances trade within the region, right? By the way, today, of course, we have the Suez Canal there. This is a much earlier canal, a successful attempt at building a canal, but by the way, would not be maintained up until the present. So, as I mentioned, he will continue expanding the empire to the east in India, but also coming into conflict with the Greek after his conquest of Thrace. And probably this is the first time that the Persians are actually successfully resisted. The decisive battle between the Persians and the Greeks will be the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE, fought in Greece. And this is after the Persians had come into conflict with Athens, which had kind of assisted a rebellion of some of the Greek city-states in Anatolia that at this point were already under Persian control. And this is what had kind of incited Darius to launch a campaign against the Greeks in Greece. So the battle was won by the Greeks, and so he was unable to bring them under his control. It was actually a pretty significant defeat, though it won't be the end of their encounters with the Greeks, as we're going to find out when we look at developments in ancient Greece. One interesting aside, you might be thinking to yourself, marathon, I know that word. It means a race of about 26 miles in length. Well, it actually, the word marathon comes from the Battle of Marathon, because after the Greeks won, a messenger ran 26 miles to Athens to let them know that they had been victorious. By the way, he died immediately after conveying the message. I've often wondered why he was running so hard. I could understand it if they had lost, but given that they had won, seems he could have taken it a bit more easy. But in any event, right, the length was 26 miles, and that's where we actually get the modern-day marathon, which is a 26-mile race. So, the Persian Empire, under Darius, the greatest the world had ever seen, consisting of 20 satrapies or administrative provinces, with each satrapy ruled by a governor or satrap viewed as a representative of the king. So the satrap would definitely have been Persian, but as we already talked about, much of each province's administration would have been made up of indigenous folk, right? People from that region, and many of the administrative structures would have reflected local practice. So if you were allowed to, kind of a certain degree of autonomy, administration, your own religious practices, did you have any obligations to the Persian government, to the Persian ruler, to the empire as a whole, right? And basically it came down to two things. You had to provide tribute, i.e. revenue, and that would go to kind of maintaining the central government, which did have some responsibilities, right? Responsible for justice and security in the broadest sense. And you also had to provide in the form of military levies young men to serve in the Persian army. And of course, whatever military forces might be in your province would have been under direct Persian control, under the control of the satrap or governor. Now, from Darius onward, satraps were definitely always men of Persian descent, right? There had been a little, it's kind of maybe not entirely accurate before. Initially, there was some flexibility in that regard, but at some point it's considered that at the very highest level of government, it should be someone Persian. And in fact, the major ones would have been members of the king's family. They would have been princes. And at some point, the positions will become hereditary, which probably ends up not being a good thing, right? Because up until a point, in part, you had to demonstrate that you were capable, right? It was a bit of a meritocracy. Those who showed a capability for governing might have ended up as a satrap. When it becomes hereditary, then it's more about the fact that you're the son of the previous satrap. Some historians, by the way, believe that there existed officials in satrapal courts who spied on the satraps on behalf of the king. And this probably became even more common, after it became the practice that the satrap should be a member of the king's family, meaning that they might have a claim to the throne, meaning that they might be conspiring, in their provincial court, and you wouldn't really know what's going on, right? But what might inhibit them from doing that is, kind of suspecting, even if not knowing, that someone among their court was actually a spy for the king. Now, to be sure, the king, and often the term we use actually for Persian rulers is Shah, would have had absolute authority, right? Often referred to simply as the great king. They were not gods. They were not perceived as gods the way Egyptian pharaohs were, but they were representatives of the chief Persian god Ahura Mazda. And we're going to learn more about him momentarily. And inasmuch as he had ultimate authority, the king was perceived as being the source of all justice, and all subjects were his servants, over whom he had the power of life and death. And related to this, there was kind of a desire to present the king as this kind of awe-inspiring remote figure, right? Someone that you couldn't just very easily approach. And if you sought an audience with the king, with the Shah, right, there would have been many kind of ritualistic traditions that you had to carry out as you approached him, in terms of how you behaved to him and showing the proper deference and so forth. This is someone who represents the will of the gods, or at least the chief Persian god Ahura Mazda. What this meant, though, is that often the Persian kings had, very little interaction with regular people, right? They were generally secluded, living in these great palaces, and that did inspire awe, right? They were, these remote people. There was a lot of propaganda in terms of, the imagery that would have been promoted of the king. But this also meant that very often they had little idea about what was going on in their kingdom. They were dependent on government officials from telling them what was going on. Very often these individuals would have been sycophants. Basically their chief concern would have been pleasing the king, telling him what he wants to hear. And so the kings became very detached, right? As they became wealthier, and a lot of this reflected that the level of taxation on their subjects in the form of tribute was growing and growing. And so there would be a lot of resentment, a lot of grumbling, and the kings very often unaware of that. That would become a problem down the road. Now, of course, given the size of their empire, I think it would be understood that they had a pretty formidable army. It's a professional standing army, right? And this isn't always the case, right? Like where you literally have, in a sense, regular folk who are compelled to serve in the army for a specific period of time. They are paid for their service. And as we mentioned, one of the chief responsibilities of the various provinces is to provide contingents of young men to serve. What is nice, unlike with the Assyrians, they're not all kind of mixed together. These different regiments would be made up of different contingents, able to maintain their own specific identity. In terms of how the army is structured, probably the most important element would have been the cavalry, which consisted of a force of 10,000, so a very large cavalry. There is an infantry, and we should make special mention of an elite fighting force known as immortals. And these individuals are made up only of Medes and Persians. Only Medes and Persians are permitted to serve in this elite infantry force. Some of you might have heard of the Immortals if you saw the movie 300. They are presented as this kind of almost, kind of monstrous beings. That the idea that they can't be killed, hence the term immortal. The image below is actually from the movie 300. In fact, they can be killed, or could be killed, right? They were regular human beings. The idea is that they always had a reserve of immortals, and whenever someone was killed, one of these reserves would take their place. So it created the impression, I mean, if you were fighting against them, that no matter how many of them you killed, their numbers never went down, right? So really this feeling that somehow they were immortal, right? No, again, no matter how many you killed, when you looked up, there was still the same number of them there, right? So a kind of psychological element here of psychological warfare that might serve to demoralize an opponent. But definitely not monstrous beings as depicted in the film 300, though I should note, I remember talking to a historian of the ancient classical world, someone very familiar with the history of ancient Greece, and she commented on the film to me that, while that would not have been an accurate depiction of the actual Persian immortal soldiers, that is very much how the Greeks might have depicted them in their own telling of what happened. So the last thing I want to discuss before we finish this lecture is the religion of the Persians, known as Zoroastrianism, what some historians believe might be one of the Persians' most important cultural contributions corresponding to their religious beliefs, and one that will, a religion that many historians feel will have a major impact on the manner of Christianity's development, also with respect to Islam, perhaps Judaism. So let's learn about Zoroastrianism. First of all, if we go back to the very earliest history of the Persians, it would seem they practice a popular religion that initially focused on the worship of the powers of nature, not unlike what we've encountered prior to now, for instance, with the ancient Mesopotamians. And then by the 6th century BCE, a new religion had arisen around a legendary figure known as Zoroaster. Sometimes we use the name Zarathustra to refer to him. Worth noting because, among other things, a very famous German philosopher named Nietzsche in the late 19th century will kind of borrow that name or that figure, will appropriate him in a book called Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he uses this figure as a way of kind of explaining his own philosophical ideas, which really had nothing to do with Zoroastrianism. But you might come across it, so thought I'd mention it. So, okay, Zoroastrianism taking its name from its founder, not from its chief god. According to Persian tradition, again, Zoroaster born in 660 BCE, will become a kind of prophet figure following a period of wandering and solitude, when he experiences a series of revelations regarding the true religion, which then eventually he begins to teach to a group of disciples, eventually getting written down. Now, it doesn't actually get written down until much later, so what his original teachings were, from a historian's point of view, hard to say. Right, the sacred book of Zoroastrianism not written down until the 3rd century CE, right? So almost 900 years later. But some historians looking at what's written there, kind of thinking about the language, the plausibility of this or that passage being traced back to Zoroaster, have been able to piece together what they think his message probably was, like the essence of it, dating back to his time. So what did Zoroaster teach? Something akin to monotheism. Right? He taught that Ahura Mazda, long an Iranian deity, was the only god, and that his religion was the only perfect one. Right? So this Ahura Mazda, the way he describes him, sounding very much like the god of the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, the Islamic faith, and so on. Ahura Mazda brought all things into being, so he's a creator. He possesses the abstract qualities or states that all humans should aspire to: good thought, right behavior, and piety. Here's the thing, right? He runs into this problem, and it's actually a problem that all monotheistic faiths run into. If there is only one God responsible for everything in this universe, then that would mean that this one God is also responsible for all that's bad, right? And all that's wrong, for evil, for falsehoods, right? For wrong behavior. And, that becomes problematic for a host of reasons, right? I mean, for one thing, kind of a reluctance to attribute bad things to the one true God. For another, it raises the problem of free will. If this one God, all-knowing, all-powerful, created everything, including everything evil, then how are individual humans to be held accountable for wrongdoing? The solution in Zoroastrianism is dualism, right? They really emphasize this idea of opposition between two things, of good versus evil, and thus responsible for all that is wrong in the world is not Ahura Mazda, but rather his opposite, Ahriman, right? Though supreme, Ahura Mazda is not alone. He is opposed by the evil spirit Ahriman, who represents such qualities as falsehood and death. And the universe is in a cosmic struggle between the two. Related to this, Ahura Mazda has granted all humans free will. We have the power to choose between following Ahura Mazda and doing what's right, or following the temptations of Ahriman to do what's wrong. Now, to be clear, Ahriman is presented as being inferior to Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda is the one true God, all-powerful, and so forth. But in terms of how, various stories and, various theological understandings of this cosmic struggle between good versus evil, very often Ahriman feels somehow as if he is equally powerful as Ahura Mazda. And so I mentioned that some historians feel that Zoroastrianism had a major impact on Christianity, and it kind of has to do with this idea of dualism, which is also heavily featured in the Christian faith, right? This idea of good versus evil, of this kind of counterpart to God, Satan, who, very often will tempt human beings to do what's wrong, right? And of course, in the Christian faith, the devil is not anywhere near as powerful as God. But if you think about kind of popular accounts dealing with the devil, whether in, you're talking about biblical stories, or if you're talking about more recent films like The Exorcist and so forth, often the devil feels like super powerful and God seems somehow nowhere to be found, right? So maybe The Exorcist is a bit too old for some of you. Maybe better popular reference would be Constantine. In any event, right, some historians feel that some of these notions about good versus evil that are so prevalent in Christianity might reflect Zoroastrian influence. Hard to confirm, because for a historian we need to find actual primary sources evident of this kind of interaction between members of the two faiths. We have some things, but nothing conclusive. But if we think about the dualism in Christianity, there are a lot of similarities with what we find in Zoroastrianism, right? So according to Zoroaster, not just this idea of good versus evil, of God versus Satan, and so forth. There's also the idea of a final judgment where Ahura Mazda will eventually triumph, and this will lead to a final separation between good and evil. And related to that, each soul will face a final evaluation of his or her actions. Those who were good would go to paradise. Those who had committed evil would be thrown into the abyss, or something very much resembling the Christian hell. Again, the subject of much debate, no conclusive answer, but certainly very plausible. By the way, the image on the left is a guardian angel, and we have those ideas in Christianity as well. I don't know if some of you have ever watched the movie It's a Wonderful Life, centered around a guardian angel coming down from heaven to help some guy who's really found himself in a bit of a fix. This one is the symbol of Faravahar, who was a very popular guardian angel in ancient Persia. So just concluding, right, regarding Zoroastrianism's influence, it would eventually spread. Eventually it is adopted by the Persian kings, related to which it becomes something of an elitist religion, right? So if you remember, the Persians very tolerant of other religions. They weren't pushing Zoroastrianism on anyone. In fact, they weren't even encouraging people to become practitioners. They kind of saw it as something belonging to Persians, and especially belonging to members of the elite strata. Nonetheless, extremely influential on non-elite religious practices and other religions. This abstract struggle between good and evil, with Zoroastrianism, kind of the first time we see it as something really concrete. Spirit of evil becomes an actual being to be warded off by spells and incantations. So even if Zoroastrianism didn't have a direct influence on Christianity, We certainly find evidence of its cultural influence in terms of, kind of common practices. But again, right, maybe, it did have an impact on Christian ideas about the dualism of good versus evil, heaven versus hell, and a final judgment day. This may reflect Zoroastrian influence, but again, as a historian, right, we need written records to confirm that. We need, concrete evidence, not just that you have similar ideas, but that you have actual evidence of, kind of some kind of interaction between the practitioners of the one faith and those of the other. In any event, this is a good place to conclude our discussion of the Persians. And as usual, don't forget to respond to the lecture-based questions, and really to stress, right, the questions are lecture-based. Whatever you write should be based on information contained in the lecture. You might certainly borrow a bit from the textbook, but you shouldn't be doing an independent research for this using Google.